Hey folks, Chuck Black here. We are doing our quaka walkthrough, or as I like to call it, quaka waka, just because I'm silly and that sounds fun to say. Way more fun than quaka walkthrough. So in this particular lesson, we're actually going to look at the code. Yay, you say. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about this picture. Boo. Or maybe you don't boo pictures, I don't know. You want to get to the code. But I'm going to explain a little bit about this. Then I'm going to say, okay, well, how did I end up with building Quaka the way that I did? I'm going to show you that I didn't come up with it on my own. This is the general pattern for how the Flask people say you should build a large application. So I'm going to talk about that. I just like having pretty pictures over here, so we're going to do that. And then we're going to actually get to the code and look through it. So hopefully it will make sense to you. If not, as always, just send me questions in the comments or make comments or whatever. Enjoy. Okay, so let's get started talking about how Quaka runs inside of Flask, how it initializes itself and gets everything going. So as a little bit of background, you can see this picture right here. I've drawn this grayish rectangle called it Flask, and inside of that there's this thing called Quaka which is running. Why are we doing that? Why does Quaka need to run inside Flask? What is the benefit of Flask? Why aren't we just writing an application like a normal application? Well, to understand that, let's take a look at what actually is going on in some of the code that we've written so far. Here's my nested data application. And this nested data application, actually, like all of these applications that I've written, basically what's going to happen is when we run it, it goes out and does what it needs to do, and then it finishes. So it starts, it's completed everything that we've asked it to do. And you can see here at the very end, oh look, PyCharm wants me to update it. Or maybe it already has updated itself. I'm not sure. Let me get rid of that just so we can see it. But anyway, the main thing is it ran and it exited. That's basically what happens when you write an application. You may have called it a script in the past. It goes out and it runs and it completes. Clearly, in the environment in which we are running, where we want things to be up and going for a long time, that's not what we're interested in. We want something that lives and continues to run forever. Now we can write an application that basically does that, but we also want it to be able to provide user interface type data so that we can provide for something like this. We want it to be able to run in the background and do polling and discovering and monitoring and all this other good stuff. And so that's why applications like Flask, you may have heard of Django. There are many of these in other languages as well that exist in the open source world that have been written that keep me and you from having to re-implement the wheel over and over and over again. And so what Flask has done is it provides this environment in which we can have our application run. Now, the typical Flask application that you can see in tutorials is very trivial. In fact, if I was just to say Flask tutorial here, then I would see something that explains to me how do I get my initial Flask project up and running. And if we go down here far enough, then we will see what our project actually is going to look like. And it's going to look something like this. It's very trivial. It has everything together in one little file, and it is nice for what it does, just printing hello world when somebody goes to the website. But that's really not what we want in a larger application. And consequently, what we have done with Quaka, what I have done, I guess is the better way to put it, because I don't want to blame other people for what I've done, is I've modeled Quaka after this larger application model. And the basic idea is that you create a directory structure that looks something like this, and you begin to build it with packages that will include things like views and controller functionality, etc., if you choose to do that. Now let me point out something to you. When you look at things like this, you're going to see things of this nature. And you're going to say, oh, okay, so let me look in the quaka code and see where all of that is. And if I was to go to the quaka code, you would see it doesn't exist. I don't have stuff like that. All of the HTML and CSS code is not built in the same way that the stuff that we were looking at is. So you're going to find that it's different. There's not static, there's not templates, etc. Why is that? Well, if you hearken back to the picture that we showed you, remember there are two different parts of our Quaka application. One is the thing that's running in the background, basically doing stuff, in that it would be providing the RESTful API, doing the monitoring and the discovery, going out to devices, providing these type of diagnostic functions, etc. That is one piece, and that is the main Python piece. We have another piece that implements the user interface. That's going to be providing the web pages, etc. Now, if you look back here, you may have seen I have something called Quaka UI. That's true, but that's not part of my Flask application. That just happens to be code that we've written within the React framework. So hopefully that makes some sense to you and you understand what it is that we're doing. I just wanted to clarify that we don't have this stuff. Now here we get to the important part. How is it that you're going to build your application? Well, let me show you a couple of things that are going to be very important. This is going to seem like mumbo jumbo to you, and let me tell you this, if you're new to developing things of this nature. Sometimes when you're using an application framework, there is going to be stuff that just is. There's nothing magical about the way that they decided to do it. It just turned out to be the best way to implement it. And the way that they implemented it in Flask for larger applications is with two main Python files. One of the Python files is this one right here, __init___.py. If you look up here in my PyCharm, you can see I have that as one of the files that we're looking at. The second file is actually called setup.py, and all that has is this information in it. The last thing that we will need to do, and I've done this in my login script, is I've set up this environment variable called Flask to be equal to Quaka. If you've looked at the Quaka VM, etc., and seen how that works, then you will see that that's going to be pointing at Quaka. So let's look at these things. Let's start at this one. Basically, this is setup.py. And so I'm going to come over here. I'm going to look at Quaka. This is all that we care about. I'm going to close that so we can see at the highest level, at my highest Quaka level, there's a file here called setup.py. That's this one that I've shown you right here. This is all that's in it. I did not have to write any of this code. I just followed what was recommended over here by the creators of the framework or the design for how you ought to create a large Flask application. All I did, as you will see down here, I changed your application to be equal to Quaka. So I've replaced that with Quaka. That's all that I've done. This is necessary for running Flask, and therefore Flask is going to look at this in order to know, okay, what am I supposed to run? You don't have to know any of the details. You can certainly look at them for them at some point if you want to go deeper into how Flask works, but this is not something that Quaka needs to worry about. We just have to implement it in that way. The second thing that we care about is within Quaka, you can see I have all of these different packages and folders, etc. And then I have one little file here. It's called __init.py. We will tend to not say the underscores, so I'll just say init.py, my init file. That's the one that I've opened here. And this is where all of the initialization magic happens. And so let's look through this and see what actually is going on when Flask initializes the Quaka application. So we're starting the actual code walkthrough here. We're in file init.py. One of the first things you might notice here in PyCharm, it is helpfully telling me that I have 23 warnings. What? That doesn't sound very good. And I'm usually a very precise and clean developer. I don't like there to be warnings sitting around. So I'm going to go ahead, and one thing in PyCharm that's nice, I can click on this and it's going to tell me what's going on. And I can look here and say, oh, module level import not at the top of the file. You'll see there's a bunch of those. And then the last one, if I click on this, it takes me to actually where it is, blank line at end of the file. Well, that I can actually fix, and that one will go away. You can see that went away. What we like to see is what you can see here, like in my nested data. See that green check mark? That usually tells me about happiness. If I go over to setup here, you can see I have 1 week warning. If I was to click on it, it would show me up no new line at the end of the file. So that's the opposite of what I had before. You see down here, see this little squiggly line? That is a violation of PEP. I don't even know why that exists, but I'm going to go ahead and fix it, and my problems should have gone away. And for some reason, it's not showing that it has gone away, and I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe I have do I have a line there? Oh no, there it is. It finally updated it. Okay. So it takes PyCharm a while. In the background, it comes and figures these things out. But back to where we were. In my file here, this is kind of a large init file. I probably should clean it up a little bit and move some things into a utility file. But you can see I do have all these weak warnings. Now what it's telling me is that it doesn't like it that I have import statements that are not up at the top of the file. Now in general, I always put my import statements at the top of the file. In certain situations, like for Flask, and we're not going to go into all of these details, you need to wait to have your import statements either later in the file or inside sometimes functions. I don't have functions here, but sometimes you need to do that. It's because of circular imports. Let's see if I can go back. If you end up going down far enough, you can see this is a big enough problem that even in just talking about large applications, they talk about circular imports. And one of the things that they talk about is having to muck around with your views, etc. So just be aware of that. What you can do, you can see if I hover over this, it's telling me that there's an issue. If I were to click on this, it gives me a little idea light bulb. I'm going to click on that. I'm going to say, please ignore errors like this. Let's see if this actually works. So it has gone through. You can see down here that it says now there are no problems in init.py. I'm going to assume that this will go back to 0 warnings and have a positive check mark at some point in time in the future. Don't worry about that for right now. I need you to pay attention to what we're going to be doing right here as we go through this file. So let's get started. My very first line in my init file is going to be to import Flask. I told you not to worry about it, and then I kept looking at it. There it is, my green check mark. I like that. So I'm importing Flask. This is what I need to do. Now, one thing that we haven't gone into too much, what do you notice here that's different than some of the stuff we've talked about? And I can't remember if we've used this before. You'll certainly run into it. Do you see how Flask is capitalized? Within Python, typically what we do is we capitalize items that are actually classes. And so here we are. You're doing a little bit of object-oriented programming. I'm having people ask me about this. We are consumers of object-orientedness, and we will continue to be this way when we get into using NetMiko and Napalm and things of that nature. But for right here, you can see, okay, well, we're going to be using this capital F Flask thing. All right, that's cool. We expect that. Now, the next thing here, you don't have to worry about this too much. I am actually going to be importing this thing that I don't know how people pronounce that, whether they say CORS, whether they say cores or whatever. We're going to need to be importing this because we are going to be allowing external browsers to come get access to our web service, and I have not installed certificates on my web service. You kind of need to do it associated with your host, etc. I haven't taken any steps security-wise in order to do that, so I need to have this there. Don't have to worry too much about that from a network monitoring, etc. standpoint. That is for allowing external browsers to get access to it. Now, I have written something called log console, which is going to allow me to more simply log things to the console without having to worry about always putting in the date and time, etc. So I have written this little thing called log console, so we're going to be making use of that. Now, the first thing, and if you recall from looking at this, you will see right here, here's my from Flask import Flask. That's what we have up here. Then the next thing that they do is app equals Flask __ name. And you can see that is exactly what I have right here. So this is what they are telling me I need to be doing in creating a larger application. And so I am following the model that they have talked about. Put this in your mind that we're doing views afterwards. All right, so let's go back here. I'm setting up my application. I call it app because they did, and I'm calling it Flask. Now, what people have asked me, what's this __ name? Let me do two things. First thing I have to say is there's some stuff that you might consider magic or mumbo jumbo, etc., that just is in Python, and one of the built-in variable names is this thing called __ name __, and it's the name of the application. And I didn't set that. It just is. If you see something with two underscores, it usually means that it's special, and in this situation, it certainly is. Now the next line, and so I've set up my application. This is setting up my Flask application. The next line, remember I said I was going to be using this cores thing? Well, this is me doing it. So this is me saying, okay, I want you to allow browsers to get access to us without throwing errors when they try to get access to our website from a different system than localhost. So that is what that's about. Now this is a database type thing, and it's here. I'm not exactly sure why I set it at the top of this file because I haven't done the other database stuff. I'm going to do that shortly. But you can kind of get the idea. Okay, well, this looks like an SQL Alchemy thing. SQL Alchemy is going to want to track modifications, I guess, to the data. I'm not sure. I looked this up online and I Googled it and found out that if you set this to false, it gets rid of some warnings that are unessential and not really relevant and can be safely ignored. So I'm setting app.config. What is app? This is this thing right here. You're going to find, remember I said this was a class? The way that you reference items within a class is you use the dot notation. And so I'm saying app.config, and this config is clearly going to be a dictionary. And so I'm setting the key, SQL Alchemy track modifications, the value associated with that to false. So it's a Boolean. Now the next part of this is going to be a fairly long set of configuration environment variables. And so you can see I import OS, and then I'm going to use os.environ.get. That is going to get me environment variables. And you can see this is the environment variable name that I'm looking for. This is the default value. And so I'm going to do this for something that is going to become the device monitor interval. I'm going to set the compliance monitor interval, configuration monitor interval. That's where I go out and read configurations from devices. Host monitor, service monitor, discovery interval, and the worker interval for making sure that the workers are available. I check the database to make sure that they have checked in with their heartbeat. All of this stuff I probably should put into some type of a utility file so that this gets a little bit easier to read. So that's bad on my part, but that's basically what that's all about. And if you want to know more about how this actually works, yeah, you can look into the details of this os.environ.git. It's a pretty common thing to do. Now here's something important. This is where I'm beginning to do the database stuff. So here I declare that I'm going to import this thing called SQL Alchemy from Flask SQL Alchemy. Remember, that's something that we installed. And so I'm going to say, okay, I need you to go to Flask SQL Alchemy. I want to import this thing that is capital SQL Alchemy. You see, because it starts with a capital, that it's probably a class, and it is going to be a class. And so what I'm going to do then is I'm going to set up my database, and that's what this is. Now, you can see I've left both of these in there. As you can imagine, this is what I used to do because I was using what database? SQLite. But what am I using now? I'm using Postgres, and I have configured my system to have Postgres installed. I've created made the database available. And so what I need to do now, remember app is the thing that we set up here. It's Flask. Basically, it's my Quaka application. And so I say app.config. And again, here's another one of these config things. I'm setting up SQL database URI. That is, where can I find my database? And this is my database. It's called Quaka. And this is the syntax that I use. You can see for SQLite, the database is a little bit different. It is actually a file. And the file when I used SQLite was /temp/testdb. Again, I'm using standard patterns for how SQLite said to do it. So I just followed that. But now I've grown up a little bit. I've got my big boy pants on, and I'm using a real-life database. And so I'm using Postgres. This is the syntax that they use. This is the name of the database that I have created. And we will look at that in a little bit. But you can see I've set it up. And now I'm able to say this variable called db, I'm going to create an object that is of type SQL Alchemy. Remember, I imported that, and I'm passing in this Flask application. It's going to use the application to read configuration parameters in order to know how to get at that actual database on my system. And we are going to use DB when we begin to talk about our database. Okay, so I'm going to close things up here for this lesson because I don't want to cram too much into this particular video, and I want to make sure that you guys understand what exactly we've done. So you understand the picture of what Quaka is doing and how it's running inside of Flask. You can see that we imported it, and then once we went down here, we actually created the Flask application. Once we got done with all of this environment variable type stuff, then we got down to business with our database. We imported SQL Alchemy. We set it up, and we created an instance of our SQL Alchemy object, passing in our application, and we call that database. Next, what we will be doing is we're going to look at views. Actually, when we get down here, I should have a space in here so it's a little bit easier to see, and I probably would do it like this if I wanted to keep things organized in a little bit better way. We're going to look at all the views, and we'll look at actually the database creation point once we're done with the views, and then we're going to begin to look into that. So hopefully this makes sense. You have a general idea what's going on. Remember, we're just following the model that was set up in this particular description of how to do large applications. We've got our init and our setup. Remember, we went through those two different applications, and we showed you that we're actually running inside Flask. So our little application is running inside Flask, and we're just getting started up. We've created our Flask shell in which we'll run. We've begun to create our database connectivity, and then we're going to begin to actually do things like creating our REST APIs, etc. Hopefully you understand that. If you don't, feel free to put questions in the comments, and I'll try to be good at looking at those comments, questions, and answering them as they come up. Thanks a lot.